Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matt here, and it is that time of the week again. It is Meta Monday. It's a series we do on the channel every Monday where we take a look at the current metagame for Pokemon TCG Pocket. We give our analysis and we kind of break down the things that are changing or staying the same, all of the different progressions in the current metagame, and I'm really excited. So this week we have the Days Pocket Weekly. It's the tournament that we typically take a look at here on the Limitless Tournament platform. Link will be down in the description below if you want to visit this website, but this tournament this week had basically 2,000 players. I think we had 1,950 players, by far the largest weekly Pokemon TCG Pocket Tournament. It gives us a large enough sample size week by week to kind of see how things are changing in the current metagame. So, right off the bat, these are the standings for the tournament, the overall standings, as we can see here. Gyarados taking the win, as well as getting 3rd place and 7th place. And then if we go down here quite a ways, we see some other Gyaradoses here that made it into sort of the top bracket. I think all decks that went kind of 8 and 2 made it into the final top cut bracket here. Let me just double check. So if we go to the just this top cut, the standings for the top cut, yeah, we see quite a few decks. I'm not sure exactly how many this is, but I think everybody that went 8 and 2 made it into top cut. So we'll take a look at just the top cut in its own. But let's take a quickly and look at the overall standings of the tournament. So something really interesting here was that Charizard had actually a really good outing this week in the Days Pocket Weekly, and this actually isn't super surprising to me. It's been a development that we've seen kind of over time. The one thing that I thought was surprising, that nowhere in the top 16, well, I guess one deck in the top 16 was playing Celebi EX and Exeggutor, but if we go down a little bit, we see that there's actually 5 or 6 Exeggutors that made sort of top cut. Definitely the best way to play Celebi and Exeggutor. We'll take a look at that in a little bit, but again, let's focus on just sort of the top here of the top decks. Gyarados taking the win this week, taking down Charizard and Arcanine in the finals, and then we have another Gyarados and Mewtwo, one Pikachu EX up here, another Charizard, and another Gyarados, and then a bunch of Mewtwo's and Pikachus and stuff as we go farther down. So the development here isn't very surprising in terms of the overall results of the tournaments, being that Gyarados did win this week. We kind of know that Gyarados is very much kind of the strongest deck of this format. However, there is more to sort of unravel with these particular standings here. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to go into the playing to win, which is what they kind of call their top bracket. And if we go here, if we look into the pairings, this gives us sort of an idea of, you know, what decks matched up with which, right? But let's go ahead. We'll go back into the standings real quick, and I just want to take a look at the standings of the top cut bracket, right? This will give us an understanding. Basically, these are all of the decks that made it into that final bracket for the tournament, and then, you know, their records as we go in. So as we see at the bottom of this, we see a lot of Gyarados, but mainly a lot of Celebi, right? So a decent amount of Celebi Exeggutor decks did make it into the final bracket, but they kind of all lost. There's only one deck that even won one game. The rest of them went 0-1. And again, I think the reason for that is that Celebi is a strong deck, but once you get into the final bracket, you end up hitting a lot of really good players, but also kind of decks that are in general a little bit stronger. Things like Mewtwo, things like Gyarados and Charizard, even Pikachu as well, which doesn't typically have a great matchup against Celebi, but here's what we can do just to kind of take a look at this. Well, actually, let's go ahead. Let's take a look at just this #1 player real quick. Lead is his name, and we'll see the matches that he played in Top Cut. This was the winning deck. There was actually an Articuno and Greninja deck that we'll take a look at that made Top Cut. But he beat Articuno round 1, then beat Mewtwo, and then beat another Gyarados, and then beat another Mewtwo until he ran into that Charizard, which also made it into the finals here. Pretty bad matchup for Charizard. Unfortunately, didn't get the win there. But, you know, the thing with Charizard is it actually has a pretty decent matchup against all of the other top decks in the format. And I'm actually not surprised that we see a couple Charizard decks here that went very far into the tournament. We also see an Arcanine and Moltres that made it into top cut as well. But let's go ahead. Let's take a look at this Gyarados list. I don't think we're going to see anything surprising. This is the list that won the tournament. This is pretty much considered to be the strongest deck in the format right now, with Gyarados, Greninja, and Druddigon, 2 Leaf, 2 Professor's Research, 2 Misty, and 2 Pokeball. So basically everything you would need in a deck like this. Very consistent, very straightforward in how this deck operates. Now, Gyarados is fairly heavily countered by certain decks in the format, like Pikachu EX and like the aggro fighting decks, but we actually only saw one fighting deck make it into top cut, which again opens up the avenues for Gyarados to be pretty dominant, since that is really one of the only hard counters. There were quite a few Pikachu and some Strikers, but unfortunately, as we saw, that Gyarados that won the top cut bracket didn't end up even seeing a single Pikachu, which is a big reason why that's kind of the case. If we look at this player here, the guy that got top 4, with Gyarados and Greninja, we also see that he didn't face up against Pikachu, but he did actually beat an Aerodactyl and Primeape. So there wasn't enough representation, I don't think, in this top cut bracket of Pikachu and the aggro Aerodactyl fighting deck for Gyarados to kind of have something standing in its way. And that's really the only decks that can match up very properly, at least against Gyarados. Everything else it has a really strong matchup against, so I'm not really surprised at all. But I want to take a look at this Charizard deck and the players that he beat. So it makes sense. We beat a Celebi. He actually took the win over a Mewtwo, which is interesting. I would like to actually see this guy's deck list to see if he's playing Mew EX in his list. If he is, it's actually interesting that he lost to Charizard here. We do see one Mew EX in his list, so definitely really interesting that Charizard got the win over this Mewtwo, and then also beating Pikachu and Substrika as well, and a Gyarados. So this Charizard went on quite a run, basically beating the other 4 best decks in the format to make it into the finals, unfortunately to lose to the Gyarados deck. But let's take a look at this Charizard and Arcanine list. This is actually basically the same exact deck from last format that ended up doing extremely well as time went on. In Genetic Apex, it was heavily dominated by Pikachu and Mewtwo for a very long time. Most people kind of decided that those were the best decks of the previous format, but then a lot of people realized, well, why don't we just sort of play the entire package here with Charizard and Arcanine and Moltres? It makes the deck a little bit less consistent. However, it gives this deck a tremendous upside, meaning that if you draw all the cards that you need to, if you draw well and you get a little bit lucky in your matches and you make the right plays, of course that's important, but if you get lucky in your draws and how the deck kind of flows, the upside for Charizard is extremely high. In fact, I believe still that the upside for Charizard is higher than any other deck in the format. The inclusion of Leaf to be able to get Moltres out of the active spot for basically a guarantee. Other decks as well, you can move Arcanine out of the active spot for all the Pokemon have retreat cost of 2. So it makes the deck flow a little bit better having Leaf in there. There's a lot of Pokemon in Charizard, so there's not a lot of room for kind of counterplay. But the thing is, you don't need like Giovanni in your deck. You really don't even need Sabrina. The thing is with Charizard is that the main strategy is the same strategy overall. If you get your Charizard set up with energies, there's nothing really that can stand in your way. There's not a lot of cards that can one-shot a Charizard EX, while Charizard EX is one-shotting everything in the format. So it really comes down to, like, are we drawing all of those cards that we need to? Are we getting our Charizard set up early enough? And if we do, we're kind of just winning. I mean, that's you know, how Charizard works. It's got a tremendous upside. It really is the strongest card in the game. It's just not necessarily the most consistent strategy in the game. One thing that's interesting here is sort of the a lot of the Mewtwo's got kind of knocked out by other decks early on in this tournament. A lot of Gyarados beating and Charizard also beating Mewtwo. So I think that's a really interesting development. Mewtwo typically has a pretty good advantage against Charizard in a decent matchup against Gyarados and a good matchup against Pikachu. We just didn't necessarily see it happen that way. You know, once you get into top cut, it really is kind of a toss-up of how things kind of operate. But seeing as the only Celebi decks in this tournament were Executor Celebi decks, that is an interesting development. We'll talk about that in a little bit once we see the overall meta share of the tournament, which in fact I actually kind of want to go ahead and look at. But let's take a look at the highest performing Mewtwo deck just to kind of show it. Again, it's probably going to be very standard, which it is, although the one inclusion of blue I find to be very, very interesting. Could be really useful as well in the mid to late game, just having that in your hand that you could sort of play at any point to kind of save you from getting KO'd. And probably some scenarios that I'm not necessarily thinking of off the top of my head. But yeah, last week we saw Mewtwo with Jinx actually win the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. I think Jinx is a pretty good matchup into Gyarados. Unfortunately, we might not have seen any Jinx Mewtwo decks make it into sort of high up in the top cut bracket, which might be a big reason why Mewtwo wasn't necessarily able to perform that well. But with the inclusion of Charizards, you would have thought that kind of Mew EX in Mewtwo would have made that matchup a little bit better. But here's the thing, Mew EX is good in Mewtwo, but if Charizard is just steamrolling you, if it draws everything it needs to, it's still a very, very difficult deck to beat for sure. And let's take a look quickly at the Hitmonlee and Primeape list. This seems to be kind of the best performing version, or rather the most common version of these aggro, fast-paced fighting type decks that incorporate Primeape, Aerodactyl, Hitmonlee, and Marshadow. Primeape is very strong, especially going first. It allows you to start doing 50 damage on your second turn going first. Similar to Executor, except this is only a stage 1 Pokemon, and this is a really good strategy where we can kind of go into Primeape, get maybe some early KOs. Once Primeape goes down, we can bring in our Marshadow and take a revenge KO, and then to wrap things up, we can go into our Aerodactyl, or if we're going second on our first turn, we can lead with Hitmonlee and put some good pressure on some of our opponent's bench Pokemon like a Ralts or even a Charmander, or any other, or Magikarp, right? Any other kind of smaller basic Pokemon that might get kind of caught in the active spot. So this fighting deck is good, but let's go ahead and take a look at sort of the metagame, and let's see kind of what decks people were playing here to give ourselves kind of a better understanding of why things turned out the way they did in this tournament. So as we see, Mewtwo definitely the most played deck still by a very wide margin this week. Mewtwo taking the win last week in the Ursa Days tournament. It kind of makes sense that people would kind of choose to play Mewtwo. And I think the very large amount of Mewtwo players means that it's going to be falling a lot closer to somewhere in the 50% win range. So this win rate doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. But if we go ahead and we take a look at Mewtwo and Gardevoir, we see that a lot of players here sort of in the top. Mewtwo was very heavily represented in top cut, as we see the top placement getting 4th, but we have 10th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 18th, and I think 23rd and 24th. I think all of these people that went 8 and 2 here made it into that top cut bracket, which is definitely really, really interesting. So a lot of Mewtwo made it up there, but they didn't necessarily do extraordinarily well in the tournament. Now, if you look at the card distribution for Mewtwo in this deck, we see that only 22% of decks were running a copy of Jinx EX, and most decks were running Mew EX instead of Jinx. So it's an interesting development. I think that Mew EX overall is probably better. It is certainly good in those matchups that make things a little bit more difficult for you. You can't hit for 140 against a Gyarados, and you can hit 1KO a Charizard EX in return. However, I just think that Jinx is going to be better against that Gyarados matchup. We probably didn't see any Mewtwo decks running Jinx, at least, or not many of them make it into top cut, which is probably a reason why Gyarados did exceptionally well here. But yeah, Mewtwo definitely being sort of the most played deck in the format right now makes sense to me. I still think that Mewtwo is probably tied or up there with Gyarados as sort of the two best decks in the format. Everything else really does kind of feel to be a tier below. But one thing that I really want to chat about or kind of point out is that Pikachu is still very heavily represented. Pikachu and Zebstrika also fell around 50%, and Gyarados also fell closely around 50%. So nothing really stands out here. The more decks, or the more people that are playing a particular deck, the more likely it's going to fall around 50%. It's just sort of the way it is. It doesn't mean that a deck is less strong than another. It just means that, a lot of new players are probably playing the deck, and as well as a lot of experienced players. It brings that average down to closer to 50%. It's just sort of how the competition works here in Pokemon TCG Pocket. But Pikachu and Zebstrika here around 50% win rate. The third most played single archetype with almost 200 people playing it. But if we go down to Pikachu and Raichu, which is the other kind of version of Pikachu EX, we see about 50 people playing it. So just under, about 130 or 239 people or 249 people. Can't really do my math. We're playing Pikachu, so it's basically tied right there with Gyarados as the second most played deck. However, also if we look at the Celebi decks, 132 people playing Celebi and Superior, which was more people than playing Celebi with Executor, which isn't what we should be doing. I've been trying to say this on the channel. Now, you can play whatever you like, of course, but it's been very apparent over the last few weeks that Celebi with Executor is the best way to play it, and I think that heavily is represented here in the win rates, as we see Celebi with Superior, a 41% win rate, and then with 132 people playing this deck, that is quite low. We would, again, like to see this somewhere closer to 50%, while we see here Executor and Celebi EX has less people playing it, but 103 total. That's 56% win rate. So that's literally, what is this, like 14 points higher than Celebi and Superior. So a very large difference in its win rate and its meta, placement in the meta, basically. But if you add up all of the Celebi decks here, that's 235 players, which again puts it right up there in sort of that the second most played deck, kind of tied for second with Pikachu and Gyarados. Again, I think it makes a lot of sense. If we scroll down here, we see that Executor and Mew EX, which does play Celebi. I just want to kind of showcase perhaps this deck, which I actually think I'm really high on. I really think that this is a great way to play Celebi. It's really just a focus on Executor, and you run one copy of Celebi, one copy of Mew EX, and you don't run Superior. It's really good in a lot of matchups. It's just a more consistent, kind of a faster paced way to play Celebi EX, really with a heavily reliance on Executor. Because here's the thing, like, Celebi is a really good deck in the format right now. I think it's actually emerging potentially as an S tier deck. We'll have to see in our tier list tomorrow. But really, I think the big upside to Celebi is just Executor EX in the deck. I think as the meta has changed in a way to, I guess, kind of favor some of these faster paced aggro decks, like all of these, fighting type Aerodactyl Primate decks, as well as Pikachu EX and Zebstrika, Executor has a much better matchup against those decks. It's just really good in some particular matchups. Now, it does struggle very much against the Charizard decks and the Fire-type decks, and it doesn't have a great matchup against Gyarados, but it has a good matchup against Mewtwo and Gyarados, like a decent matchup against the two best decks. So it's a very much sort of like a tempo, kind of like a more consistent version of Celebi. Now, the upside isn't necessarily as high. Of course, the upside with Superior is very, very high if you get that Superior out early, and Mew EX, or Celebi EX is able to do basically twice as much damage, or twice as likely to do higher damage with that Jungle Totem ability active. But overall, very interesting. That's, you know, basically Celebi needs a Pokemon in the front line to do decent damage while we build up our Celebi. I think it's a really perfect pairing, Exeggutor and Celebi, and I think it's really well reflected. In fact, out of any other deck here within sort of the top 10 or top 20, no other deck even had close to an average win rate of Exeggutor and Celebi EX, even though we didn't see it, a lot of them kind of get in within the top 4, top 8 of the tournament. We had a very large amount of them if we look sort of in that top cut distribution. As we see here, a lot of decks here that went kind of 8 and 2. The highest placement was only 16th and 19th, but a very large amount of these decks kind of went 7 wins, 6 wins, and 8 wins. So it's a very consistent deck. It's kind of taking the place of Pikachu in this kind of format. I think it's a little bit more well positioned for sure. But here, as we see, Charizard and Arcanine and Charizard and Moltres is rising in popularity by a pretty significant degree. About 100 people playing Charizard, and then another 40 people just playing straight Arcanine, and all of these decks actually had pretty decent win rates or performances. Now, this Charizard Moltres deck, again, pretty close to 50-50 at 48.5%. Arcanine, closer to 50% as well, and then Charizard and Arcanine 52%. So I think a really big trend right now is Charizard. I think we're going to see something very similar to what we saw in the Genetic Apex format, where as time goes on, people just kind of forget, or when a new set comes out, people seem to sort of forget that Charizard EX is a really valuable option, and it's a really, really strong deck. It's a high roll deck, but it's very, very powerful, always has the chance to win no matter what your matchup is, and that makes it really powerful in tournaments. Now, this is one thing that I really want to take a look at or talk about, basically, is the difference between a consistent deck and a strong deck, right? Just because a deck is consistent and it draws well most of the time doesn't mean that it's a more powerful deck or a better choice to play that deck in an online tournament. The reason for that primarily, and I guess here, let me just pull up like Microsoft Paint. I'm gonna try to draw like a little graph here. Let's see if we can kind of explain this interaction that I'm kind of talking about right now. All right, we're in MS Paint now. I'm gonna try to visualize what I'm talking about here between the difference between a powerful deck and a consistent deck. For example, let's just take Pikachu EX and Charizard EX, because I think that these kind of reflect the two examples that I'm talking about really, really well. So let's just quickly do like a graph, right? We're gonna just draw a graph right here, and this right here is gonna be like the upside. And then down here is going to be the downside of a deck, right? So when a deck draws well up here, and when it doesn't draw well, it'll be down here, right? So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Now, something like a Charizard, we'll draw it in red, is going to be like this. It has a very high upside, but it also has the potential to have a very, very low downside, right? Charizard can beat anything in the format if it draws well enough. The distribution for Charizard is extremely, extremely high. It has probably the highest upside out of anything in the game, but also has one of the lowest downsides of anything in the game. It can absolutely brick and basically do nothing, whereas a deck like Pikachu looks a lot more like this in its distribution of upside and downside. So Pikachu is a much more consistent deck, as we can see here. It doesn't have nearly as high of an upside as Charizard, but it also has a much better downside than Charizard. Now, there's other top decks in the format. Let's just do blue to reflect Gyarados, which has a little bit less of a high upside than Charizard, and a little bit worse of a downside than Pikachu. So here's the sort of the average distribution, which is kind of why we say that Gyarados, I think, is the strongest deck in the format. Because again, if we kind of mark the middle ranges of these graphs here, we see that Charizard on average may have a lower win rate than something like a Pikachu, and definitely a lower overall win rate than something like a Gyarados. But here's the thing, the overall upside, this area here is higher than Gyarados' upside, and it's much higher than Pikachu's upside. So while decks like this aren't necessarily super consistent like Charizard, it has the potential to be stronger than any other card in the game, which means that in a tournament, basically given a large enough sample size, let's say if 100 people in the tournament are playing Charizard, chances are one of those people is just going to get luckier and draw better than all of the other Charizard players, and going against a Charizard deck that draws extremely well, there's not much that most decks can do. Now, let me just, I guess, add Mewtwo on here as an example. Now, Mewtwo has become a lot more consistent, so its downside isn't nearly as high or as low as it was before. But basically, Mewtwo, I would put its upside is a little bit lower than both Charizard and Gyarados. But the cool thing about Mewtwo is that it doesn't have a really high downside right now either, which brings up its average distribution pretty high up, very similar to something like a Gyarados. And this is kind of how I'm distributing these decks right now, the top decks of the format. Charizard, very high upside, very high downside. Pikachu, it's very consistent deck, but its upside isn't nearly as high as things like Charizard, Gyarados, and Mewtwo. But let's take a look also at something like a Celebi, which again, if you're playing Celebi in Superior, it's very similar to Charizard in the sense that it has a pretty high upside, but the downside with Superior is also pretty significant. So I would kind of draw Celebi somewhere like this, which is why, at least with Superior, I think we're looking something a little bit like this. So Charizard would be number one, right? It's got the highest upside out of any deck in the format, but also has the lowest low side. Pikachu most consistent. Gyarados is very interesting. I think a big reason why Gyarados is so strong is because it has a really high upside, but it's also fairly consistent and fast-paced with things like Misty. It actually has a relatively low downside for how high the upside is. Mewtwo is similar to Pikachu, but it's, again, I think a little bit higher upside. And then Celebi as well also has a high upside, but a very low downside. So that's kind of my way to distribute how these decks work, basically. If this graph doesn't make any sense to you, I apologize, but I just wanted to visualize it or kind of showcase it in a particular way that I thought was at least somewhat easy to understand. If you don't understand what I'm talking about here, I apologize. But anyway, I just wanted to pull up Microsoft Paint and kind of try to visualize my understanding of these decks. Okay, now looking back into the metagame here, we can again find some interesting stuff here. Now, it is a pretty large tournament, so the sample size is large, but basically what we're seeing is very, very heavy sort of front-ended of a lot of these decks. Like even decks like Greninja and Mew, which is considered kind of an A-tier deck in my opinion, only had 23 people playing it, which is actually crazy. Scolipede, literally only 21 people playing it. So the sample size for this one tournament really isn't necessarily high enough. But as we see, look at all of these decks that aren't necessarily considered like meta decks. These are kind of weird off decks. When 2,000 people participate in a tournament, you're going to get a lot of decks that are really wacky and a little bit interesting. So not really anything that in this sort of very large area of people playing this deck, about half the tournament are probably playing decks that aren't even considered real contending decks really at all. But let's go ahead, let's filter by the win rate because I'm actually interested to see, what specific decks ended up doing really well that necessarily weren't really considered, top tier meta deck. So let's look. So Gyarados and Butterfree on the return here, which is a Gyarados deck that a lot of people are kind of interested in. Now, only one person played it, but it is actually a pretty strong deck here. It's basically, instead of running Greninja, we are running the Caterpie line, a 1/1/1 Caterpie line. Now, we can use Find a Friend. People use this to kind of thin out the deck as well as to find Metapod and go into Butterfree. It's a pretty interesting way to play Gyarados, and it also heals it up. So it's pretty good against sort of decks where they don't necessarily do well in the late game. This makes Gyarados a little bit stronger in their late game with the healing, but Caterpie does give it the ability to kind of thin through the deck a little bit more so. Let's take a look here. What other decks kind of did well that were a little bit surprising? We can filter by score here. So Greninja and Farfetch'd actually did quite well here. Only 3 people playing it, but it went 16-7, which is pretty interesting. Aerodactyl and Onix went 7-3, and Gyarados EX with Gyarados, which this is probably just straight Gyarados. Let me look. Oh, it's actually Gyarados with Frostmoth and Snob, which is interesting. It's actually probably not a terrible way to play the deck either. Frostmoth as kind of our front option here to stall out while we build up our Gyarados. I don't mind that as well. I think that's kind of cool, in my opinion. Let's go back here and let's take a look at, what was it, the win rate. Let's take a look at this Aerodactyl and Onix list. So yeah, okay, so this is cool. So we've seen Onix decks in the past, but this is basically a fusion of Onix with Aerodactyl, but then we were running that Hitmonlee Marshadow package. So it's kind of another flavor of this, aggro, fast-paced fighting deck. Onix as well doesn't seem very impressive, but we do have Brock to help accelerate energies to Onix. It basically gives us like another option to go into. We have 110 HP, so we can live some attacks here, but this is a very fun, a very interesting fighting type deck, in my opinion. What else was surprising here? So yeah, Gyarados, or rather Greninja and Farfetch'd. This is, yeah, okay. So we took a look at this deck as well recently, and this is kind of something that's emerging right now. It's a fusion between the Gyarados package, which is again good to the mid to late game to finish KOs to do some bench sniping damage. It pairs nicely with Hitmonlee, but we also have Farfetch'd and Hitmonlee as kind of starter options, and then Marshadow to take revenge KOs. The upside with this deck basically is that we're running only non-EX Pokemon, and it's a very fast-paced aggressive deck. But interesting that 2 of these decks went, yeah, and they're kind of the same deck here, although this one's not playing Hitmonlee, it's just playing Farfetch'd with Marshadow, but very similar list for sure. But it's interesting that both of these decks went 7-3. Definitely not a very kind of contending deck, something that a lot of people play. And let's see if there's anything else that's kind of surprising here of decks that weren't necessarily commonly played, but did end up doing pretty well in the tournament. So Articuno and Greninja actually, with only 7 people playing it, ended up getting a 59, almost a 60% win rate, going 29-19. And then we actually see Blastoise and Tauros going 57. 4 people played this deck. going 15 and 10. I'm actually interested. Let me take a look at this Blastoise list. There's one that went 8 and 2, which is pretty cool. And this is going to be Blastoise with Druddigon and Tauros. Okay, so I like this in a lot of different ways here. Blastoise isn't a bad card, to be honest with you. Now, it's debatable. It's probably not as good as Gyarados, and it's a very similar deck to Gyarados, but if you don't have Gyarados, you can actually build a very similar deck just using Blastoise instead. So I thought that was pretty cool, but yeah, so let me go back to the metagame. Again, just a couple points as we wrap up this video here pretty soon. This video was a little bit all over the place. I apologize, but basically, it's really interesting. There's a lot of things that we can take here, basically, in terms of the trends, how the meta is going. After we took a look at some deck lists, let's go ahead and let's talk about how things are progressing here. So, Mewtwo EX kind of cementing itself as probably the most popular deck right now. I think that this is a little bit inflated. This 400 people playing Mewtwo is a little bit inflated, mainly because it won the tournament previously to this, the last week's tournament, which makes sense. More people would play it. Gyarados won this week, so we're probably going to see a closer distribution of Gyarados being the most played deck instead of Mewtwo. But Mewtwo, as the cards in Mewtwo have been out for a little bit longer, so I think more people have probably Mewtwo built out than Gyarados. That could be one reason. Now, Pikachu kind of still staying around that third or fourth most played deck here, 192 for Zebstrika and 47 for Raichu. Now, Raichu kind of struggled in this tournament, but I think that's mainly because it's a smaller sample size, and overall, I don't think the metagame is very well positioned for Raichu right now, with the aggro fighting decks and Celebi both a little bit more popular as time goes on. I don't think that Pikachu and Raichu is probably as good in this current metagame. As things are developing, I do think it's an overall stronger deck, but you know, its placement in the meta is probably not that strong. But you know what? I'm actually kind of surprised here. So next week, what I would expect is probably to see another influx of Pikachu decks. Probably because people are going to be trying to counter Gyarados, which again will probably be the most played deck in next week's tournament or close to it. And even though Pikachu and Zebstrika doesn't have a great Mewtwo matchup, I think we could see a very a little bit of an uptick of people playing Pikachu and Zebstrika, and even a better performance in the top cut bracket. Now, one thing that I really would expect to see, in fact, I've been expecting to see it for a few weeks now, even though we haven't seen it yet, is a rise of Exeggutor EX. Exeggutor is so good in this format right now. Again, like I said, a lot of these aggro fast-paced fighting decks, a lot of Pikachu Zebstrika, and a lot of Celebi decks in general that aren't running Exeggutor struggle with a deck that is primarily focused on playing Exeggutor because it is such a great frontline Pokemon. Now, Exeggutor can struggle a little bit against Charizard, and it doesn't have necessarily a great matchup against Gyarados or Mewtwo, but you can actually build your Exeggutor deck, especially like Exeggutor and Mew. If we take a look at this list, for example, I just want to pull this up so I can kind of explain it. This deck has a lot of room, basically, for supporter cards that can improve your matchups, right? So we're running one of these small Exeggutors, which again makes sense because this deck has a focus on Exeggutor, but you could actually cut this Exeggutor. You could even cut one of these potions or this X-Speed. And you could play something like Blue. And what Blue does is it's going to reduce the damage. Exeggutor has 160. Gyarados hits for 140, but plus Greninja is 160. So we could play Blue in the deck to help our Exeggutor live an additional turn, which could be the difference of winning or losing. Also against Mewtwo. Mewtwo with a Giovanni does 160. So there are scenarios in the late game where Mewtwo or Gyarados probably will be able to KO your Exeggutor, even though Exeggutor has so much HP. So I think playing cards like Blue in your Exeggutor deck could make it a lot stronger. And also, like I said, we can cut maybe this Exeggutor, and we can cut probably a potion from the deck that necessarily aren't super needed. We could play things like a Blue, we could play an extra Sabrina or an extra Giovanni to give the deck a little bit better pace, to be able to bring up something like a Ralts off the bench or a Magikarp off the bench to take an early KO on it. So I think you can build Exeggutor decks to be a lot better against things like Mewtwo and Gyarados, but overall, I think that it has such a good matchup against the fighting decks as well as Pikachu, and just in general, I think it's just a much better card. And you can actually see, if we take a look at these decks, most people are running Exeggutor with Celebi and Superior, so it's kind of like a pile is what I would call this deck. It's just sort of an amalgamation of like so many different cards. This deck is interesting because it's only running one copy of Execute, but Execute and Exeggutor are the cards that you kind of want to start with in the deck, so it makes a little bit more sense, I think, to play two copies of Execute. Maybe you could even just play one copy of Snivy, that way it's a little bit more likely to pull it off of Pokeball. Now, you got to understand, like, some people are building decks in ways that I think are really interesting. So when I look at a Celebi deck, I think, how many times are we really using more than one Celebi EX, right? I mean, realistically, we have one on the bench, we're going to pile it up with energies, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to try to KO, especially with Exeggutor, because Exeggutor is the Pokemon that we're going to have at the front, right? It's going to be an active spot for the beginning of the game into the mid even to late game, and it's basically what's going to be sitting there taking hits, dealing damage while we build up our Celebi. So wouldn't you want to play multiple copies of Execute to be more likely to start and have Executor in the active spot as early as possible? And then you really don't need 2 Celebis. Yes, we want to be able to pull it off Pokeball. We want to be able to draw into it early. That way we can start attaching energies to it early, but really we're only playing 1 Superior in a lot of decks like these because Jungle Totem doesn't necessarily stack as well. So this is an interesting build for the deck. Now, I don't think a lot of people have necessarily figured out the best way to play Celebi still. However, it is apparent that I think decks that play Executor have a much better matchup. As we see here, this deck is running 2 basically of every copy, but in my opinion, we could even play like 1 less Snivy just to be able to basically find it more guaranteed off a Pokeball. You could play 1 copy of Celebi as well, but this deck only has 6 basic Pokemon, right? So the chances of you basically drawing into your Snivy or your Execute or your Celebi or starting with those Pokemon is pretty high, and you don't necessarily want to start with a Snivy in the active spot. So it's interesting. I think that Executor with Celebi and Superior has a pretty high upside. If we wanted to make the deck a lot more consistent, you could basically cut out the Superior entirely, cut out the Jungle Totem, and just play Executor with like Mew and Celebi. As we saw, that deck list actually had a very good win rate. So this Executor and Celebi with Superior is what this is, had a 56% win rate. But if we go down to Executor and Mew, okay, so we had a 50% win rate as well. This is a much less large sample size as well. But yeah, overall, I think that Executor should be played in Celebi. I think it's by far the best way to play the deck, and it gives you something to take KOs with early on in the game that aren't Celebi, so that we can keep our Celebi on the bench and build it up as time goes on, and then bring it in the late game. Just so many Pokemon in the deck make it a little bit less consistent, but as we see, a 56% win rate is phenomenal. It's by far the most consistently winning deck within sort of the top or most played decks of the format. But the other big thing that's happening in the current metagame right now is the inclusion of Charizard. As we saw in that funny MS Paint graph that I drew, Charizard EX is still a phenomenal pick for playing in online tournaments, and that's just because you could be one of those Charizard players that just draws really well. Your deck kind of flows really well match after match, and there's just nothing that can stand in the way of a Charizard that draws perfectly. Right? You could get your Charizard on your bench by turn 3 with like 9 energies attached to it, right? Like that's the maximum upside. If you get your Charizard with I think at least 6 or 7 energies onto it via the Moltres ability, then, or Moltres' attack, then there's literally like nothing in the game anybody can do unless they have a Mew EX set up by turn 3 basically, which if they do that, basically means that if they're playing Mewtwo but they haven't really invested into Mewtwo, which means they're not really able to KO anything in the active spot other than the Moltres, because Mew EX can't really damage Moltres really effectively. So the problem with Mew EX is that you need to get Mewtwo set up, and then you have to get basically your Mew EX set up, which can be difficult. That's a lot of energies. That's 7 energies in total. If you do get Gardevoir early on, technically it is possible, and Mewtwo is a little bit more consistent now. But yeah, I just think Charizard is such high upside. I still think the best way to play Charizard is going to be with Arcanine as well. It doesn't necessarily matter. I think they're categorizing it here on Limitless a little bit differently. Like these decks that are playing Charizard and Moltres, it says also play Arcanine. I think they're just playing 1 copy of it. So like the highest placing Charizard and Moltres deck here was only playing 1 Growlithe, 1 Arcanine, and actually was playing 1 Mew EX as well, which is interesting. I actually don't hate this. I don't know necessarily how much better it is than just playing 2 Arcanine and 2 Growlithe. There are scenarios where Mew EX is going to be very good. Peak against Mewtwo, that is certainly one scenario, but it's certainly very, very interesting if we take a look at another deck like this. So, okay, yeah, so this is basically another popular way that people are playing Charizard. So instead of playing 2 Growlithe and 2 Arcanine on top of all of the Charizard Moltres shenanigans, they're basically just playing 1 Mew EX, which is good in a lot of scenarios. In fact, you can accelerate energies to it with Moltres, but it only needs 3 energies to attack, and I think it's a pretty valid strategy. So this version of Charizard actually only won 48.5% of its decks, but if we go down to the Charizard and Arcanine, which is what I was talking about previously, this is the deck that got second in the tournament, and I think this is probably the best way to play Charizard. Is going to be just with 2 Growlithe, 2 Arcanine, 2 Moltres. It's basically the same deck from Genetic Apex, except now we have Leaf in the deck, basically. But yeah, I mean, this deck is just, it's kind of like a pile. It's very similar to Celebi in that sense, where it doesn't necessarily, have as good of an early game, but its late game payoff is just better than anything in the format. So I wouldn't really be surprised, in fact, in my tier list tomorrow, when we do our tier list, Charizard might be jumping up. I might kind of have a spicy take for both Charizard and Celebi and Executor. I think it's very interesting, but yeah, hopefully that graph that I did earlier in MS Paint was a little bit it was a little bit easier to understand, or maybe it made sense to you, maybe it didn't, I don't know. But the idea is that, you know, Charizard might not be the most consistent deck, but it does have insane potential. So if you end up facing a Charizard in the top cut bracket of any of these online tournaments, you better hope that he doesn't get lucky or draw well, because if he does, there's really nothing you can do about it, no matter if you're Gyarados, Mewtwo, Pikachu, or Celebi. So it's a really interesting development for sure. And then a lot of sort of the non-S tier, A tier decks really didn't do anything super phenomenal here. We actually only saw one like Articuno deck make it into the top cut and one fighting deck make it into the top cut. Everything else seemed basically, if we go back, let's take a look here. And this is something that we kind of expected to see as the format went on. Yeah. So like literally one Articuno deck made it into top cut and then lost basically one game. And then we had one fighting deck actually make it in, but go 2-1. Every other deck in top cut here was either Mewtwo, Charizard, Pikachu, Gyarados, or Celebi. That's it. And those are the decks right now, basically. And to be fair, like, yes, you could chalk that down to like, you know, less people playing those other decks, but there were a lot of people playing what I call sort of these A or B tier decks, right? If we look, I mean, a lot of players were playing these decks, right? Golem, 35 players, Exeggutor and Mew, 37 players, Pikachu, Raichu, 47, Aerodactyl, Farfetch, 28, 27 people are just playing straight Pikachu and Zapdos, 23 people, Greninja, Mew, 21 people playing Scolipede. There's just a lot of people playing other decks, and none of these decks even made it into the top cut, barring maybe one Articuno. So it's really interesting to see, like, all of these decks, like every single one of these people that we're seeing right here basically didn't even make it into top cut. And that's something really important to note. And I think that's how the format is going right now. I think that most people understand that the top 5, maybe the top 6 decks are really the only viable top tier sort of meta decks in the format right now. And we can kind of pick and choose as time goes on, as the meta shifts, as people change what decks they're playing, what decks become most popular. Some decks will become kind of S tier in the meta, some will become high A tier. But realistically, most of those decks really all fall within the top 5 or 6 or top 6 range, which is definitely something to note. I do think that the rise of sort of the aggro, fast-paced fighting decks is going to fall down in favor of Celebi and Exeggutor. Celebi and Exeggutor is definitely a very consistent deck. It's going to be rising in popularity, which means that these fighting decks are going to struggle, as well as Pikachu and Substrika. However, I don't think that the amount of people playing Pikachu is going to go down because Gyarados is still on top of the metagame, which means people are still going to play Pikachu to try to counter it. But overall, I would say that like Pikachu is probably a better option than the fighting decks to counter Gyarados, just because it's overall a stronger deck and it has probably a better matchup into Exeggutor and Celebi. But the fire decks are on the rise. More people are going to be playing fire, which again is going to counter those Celebi players. So the meta is shifting in a really interesting sort of dynamic. I think the top 5 decks all have pretty strong and hard counters to each other. But I think at the moment it still stands to say, or stands to reason, I guess, that Mewtwo and Gyarados are probably the strongest, highest performing decks of at least the last couple weeks. Makes sense. Mewtwo won last week, Gyarados won this week. Next week, we could see something crazy and something unexpected. I kind of doubt it, to be honest with you. We'll have to see. But overall, guys, that's been sort of my meta report. These videos are very long. I kind of just press record and I freestyle for quite a long time. So I apologize if it's a little bit hard to follow, but if you guys like these videos, please comment below. Comment, you know, what I could do differently. What would you like to see a little bit more in these decks? I don't have like too much time to edit, so I kind of have to just sort of just go off and do my thing here. But yeah, so let me know down in the comment section below, you know, what would you like to see differently in these meta videos? You know, what did you like about it? What did you didn't like about it? And comment below what you think is going on in the current metagame. Shout out to Gyarados EX for being the best deck in the game right now, probably, and winning this Ursa Days 200 or 2000 player tournament. But yeah, that's it, guys. We're gonna wrap it up. That's been our meta report for the week. Tomorrow we are doing tier list Tuesday. It's Tuesday, so we make tier lists. I think we'll probably do another updated meta tier list, just because things are kind of changing and my opinions change, and the way that, you know, the decks interact with each other amongst the top of the meta is changing every week. So I think that a new tier list probably makes a little bit of sense. But either way, I really appreciate you guys watching. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel. We post Pokemon TCG Pocket videos all the time. I really appreciate it. We are on the road to 10,000 subscribers, and we're gonna get there relatively soon. Actually, I'm pretty surprised how much, you know, how much support you guys have been giving me. It's absolutely phenomenal. And then the new expansion actually comes out at the end of January, which is only in like 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. So it's coming up quick, and things are going to be very, very different when that new set releases. It's not a new mini set, it's a full expansion with over 200 new cards. And I think a lot of basically decks that are even at the top of the metagame right now, we're going to just disappear in favor for probably a lot of other new decks. We're going to see a lot of new dark cards and steel cards, so the meta will be totally different. I'm super excited for the second full expansion to come to Pokemon TCG Pocket. But either way, guys, I am rambling. This video was far too long now. We're over 40 minutes, and I apologize. But like I said, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time. Stay tuned for tomorrow when we do Tier List Tuesday. And yeah, peace out. Have a good one.